All right, well, I think we can get started. So welcome again to the online version of the Department of Classics and Religion at the University of Calgary. I'm Dr. Marika Cassis, the head of the unit, and I want to thank you all for being here this afternoon. I'm going to just start with the land acknowledgement. Just pull that up. So I would like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Thank you all for being here. I'll just start with a little bit of housekeeping. So we're going to have Carolyn talk for about 50-55 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer afterwards, which Stephanie and I will do our best to help monitor. Please, please feel free to ask any questions at that point. I would ask everyone to keep their microphones muted for the rest of the time because it often causes feedback. Okay, so I'd like to take this opportunity I'm so delighted to be able to have Dr. Carolyn Muessig do one of our Chair of Christian Thought lectures as our new Chair of Christian Thought since July of 2020. She has come to Calgary just this year and has been a remarkable addition to our department. We stole her from the University of Bristol, where she was for 25 years before that. So she is a well-known, well-respected scholar of monastic education, women, and preaching. And her most recent book was The Stigmata in Medieval and Early Modern Europe with Oxford University Press, published this year, last year in 2020. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn the seminar over to her so she can talk to us about signs of leadership, women, and invisible stigmata in the late medieval ages. Thank you. Oh, and before Carolyn starts,
I'm muted. I just said thank you, Marika.
And I should also just tell everyone that the session is being recorded. Thank you.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that. And thank you everyone for attending. And it's really lovely to see new faces and to see some faces from long ago. Thank you for making the effort to be here. I'm just going to share a screen to upload a PowerPoint here. Can you see it?
Yep, it's all good, Carolyn.
Okay, good. I'll play from the start. Here we go. Right, so yes, I'm looking at signs of leadership, women, and invisible stigmata in the late Middle Ages. So the concept of stigmata is difficult enough. So dealing with invisible stigmata adds a whole nother layer to that. And if you are familiar with stigmatization and stigmata, it's probably through Francis of Assisi's stigmatization that is recorded to have occurred in 1224 while he was on retreat and in prayer. And he, at that time, was impressed miraculously, as we are told, by the 5 wounds of Christ on his body. So it was a bodily miracle where Christ impressed his wounds onto Francis. And what is notable too is that thereafter it was accounted that they could be seen and touched. So this is a very palpable, visible miracle. And it was quite an astounding miracle, to say the least. And there was a lot of debate about it, but the papacy was very supportive of this miracle and promoted it as a indication of not only Francis's sanctity, but God's power. And so this is a very pivotal moment in medieval religious devotion, the stigmatization of Francis. And it's after this point where we see a real development of the whole idea of the ability or possibility of being stigmatized or receiving the 5 wounds. But what's interesting, it's not always necessarily these visible wounds. In fact, it seems to be more often the notion of invisible stigmata. You know, what is invisible stigmata? You know, I say it's the indiscernible 5 wounds on the body that the stigmatic says that she or he feels on their body, but they're not perceptible to the eye, but they're just as real as the visible stigmata. And the 2 examples I'll be looking at today in particular are Gertrude of Helfta, and I'll say more about her later, as well as Catherine of Siena. I'll give a bit more detail about these individuals. But what I'd like to do is do a little bit of, this is the science bit, okay? So it's theological science, just a little bit of theological pastoral theology here. And I'd like to indicate that the idea of invisible stigmata actually is in it's introduced well before, first of all, Francis of Assisi's stigmatization. But if we look at, in particular, Peter Damien, this is where it's very much articulated. Peter Damien was a theologian, a Gregorian reformer of the papacy in the 11th century, cardinal and monk. He always referred to himself as sinner. So, he put forward some ideas, I think, that help us understand or lay the groundwork of what invisible stigmata are, or at least the way I understand them. And so he said that when a bishop is consecrated, the character or marks of the crucifixion are invisibly left on the bishop at the time of consecration. So he envisions the consecration of the bishop as a marking of Christ. The mark on the body of the bishop, the marks of Christ are made. And he combines this as well, being a reformer, with ideas of purity. And he compares the bishop's stigmata to the ritual markings of a priest, as described in Leviticus 8:23. So it's this idea of not only the markings of Christ, but the bishop is also purified through the consecration. And in a letter he writes to an archbishop, he says that a bishop might surpass all others in possessing such purity. He should strive to portray the mark, stigma, of Christ's blood clearly on himself. As the apostle says, I bear the marks of Jesus forever branded on my body. So he doesn't talk about them being visible on the outer body, but he talks about them, it's a very sacramental language, that they are marked on the bishop's body, on his soul interiorly. So he's truly marked with them, although you cannot see them. Now, Peter Damien's idea, or at least maybe not directly, but this notion of invisible stigmata in association with consecration or sacerdotal ordination, the ordination of priest, is picked up in the 12th century, the sacramental language of invisible stigmata and pastoral theology by Peter Comestor, who is Peter the Eater, Peter the Eater who ate the Bible and could remember all the words of the Bible. But he was a very influential educator and also preacher. And he wrote a sermon that captures this idea that I'm trying to articulate about invisible stigmata being associated with the ordination of bishops and priests. And he says about ordination of priests, this inscription was made on our bodies as priests, for you bear the stigmata of the Lord Jesus Christ on your body, for the mark of the character was impressed on you. Okay, so what I'm saying here is that Peter Damien and Peter Comestor and many preachers and theologians in the 12th and 13th century alluded to this invisible sacramental marking on episcopal and priestly bodies, and that this indicated their ministries. It was a mark of their ministries, the ordination. So we just keep that bit in mind, okay? That's something that I think is pivotal to the way we're going to understand the way invisible stigmata function in regards to women in the 13th and 14th centuries and beyond, but I'm not looking at those examples. So what I'd like to first do is look at Gertrude of Helfta. The Gertrude of Helfta was a nun who belonged to the German convent of Helfta, and the Helfta convent was renowned for its learning and high level of learning and amazing women who wrote various books and treatises, mystical, theological. Gertrude, along with some other Helfta nuns, but Gertrude we're focusing on right now, was recognized for her active ministry in the Helfta community. And last night I gave a talk about women's role in the medieval church, and I looked just at some Italian examples of women as spiritual advisors who were sought out by not only the community that they were surrounded by in their convent, but also by the local community. And Gertrude of Helfta fits into that profile. She is somebody who has an active ministry in the Helfta community. That is what I mean by that. She gives out spiritual advice. She's a great consoler, but also the laity, clergy, friars come to the convent to seek advice from Gertrude as well. And I should add that she doesn't have any official role, okay? This is her role as spiritual advisor. I want to also mention the Herald of Divine Love, and this is an extraordinary, humongous book produced by the nuns of Helfta, 5 books, and book 2 in particular is of interest to us for this talk because it's believed to be one of the books that was solely written by Gertrude herself. The other books seem to be a joint effort, as very often with literature produced in nunneries. It's a communal authorship, but book 2 seems to be clearly by Gertrude's own hand. So that's a very interesting book to look at, to learn about her. And one of the situations that she presents in the Herald of Divine Love in book 2, she talks about her spiritual stupor, that she doesn't feel engaged, not quite a dark night of the soul, but a real struggle to engage with her faith. Listen, she was in the monastery since the age of 4. At this point of crisis, she's about 25. But it's on the Feast of the Purification, 2nd of February, Groundhog Day to you and me, I guess. She has a conversion, not to Christianity, but a conversion to a deeper spiritual life. And it's from that moment on that she feels a greater communion and conversation with Jesus or Christ, and we start to see her engage in deep held prayer. And she talks about the power of prayer and how this enables her to get through this struggle. So she understands her, I guess you could say, this active ministry and her involvement with the Helfta community in a way as a validation. Well, her conversion is a validation of her spiritual activity and her ministry. And part of that conversion we see has to do with her sense that she's received invisible stigmata. So she's been marked. It's a crucial turning point for her, that she's marked with invisible stigmata. What we have here, this is probably a bit distracting. We have an image of Gertrude here from that 15th century manuscript you saw earlier that had Francis in it. And you're probably wondering, if her stigmata are invisible, why can't I see them? So let me just say a quick word about that. And it was held by some theologians and when they're portraying invisible stigmata in art, that just like any spiritual substance that's portrayed in art, such as a soul or an angel or the Holy Trinity, in order to indicate that it's there, it has to be visible. So that's why we're seeing all these invisible stigmatics with visible stigmata in art. It was a huge debate. Not everybody agreed that that's how it should be portrayed. But just so you know, that's why we're seeing her stigmata in these depictions, her invisible stigmata. So she said, she says a prayer, and she says to Christ, inscribe with your precious blood, most merciful Lord, your wounds on my heart, that I may read in them both your sufferings and your love. May the memory of your wounds ever remain in the hidden places of my heart, to stir up within me your compassionate sorrow, so that the flame of your love may be enkindled in me. So she prays to receive the stigmata, and lo and behold, she receives them on her heart. It's marked on her heart, the wounds of Christ, as she says. So she receives invisible stigmata, and she said that she knew she received them supernaturally and interiorly. That is, miraculously, she, above nature, she received them. It was a miracle. And she says, up to the present time, you have preserved your first and greatest gift, the impression of your wounds. Although most unworthy as I am, I did nothing to deserve it. So in a way, I would argue here that there's also a sacramental quality that we're getting from Gertrude. So she talks about receiving the invisible stigmata, and she says this is prefaced by her saying that she sometimes did wrong things, and she says is not worthy, and it's reminiscent of perhaps, you know, a priest who may have do bad actions, but regardless of what they do, the indelible marks of their ordination never fade. They are sacramental, they stay. And this is, Gertrude seems to be saying the same thing about these marks that she's received, her invisible stigmata. No matter what she does, they remain, and she feels them there within herself. So that's, I think, an important element to keep in mind about how she's understanding her stigmata. And she cherishes the gift of stigmata because she sees it as giving something to her that she doesn't have within herself otherwise. Again, a very sacramental notion. And she says, your gracious condescension, my God, is so much the greater in that you have deigned to unite the dust of my nothingness with the gold of your inestimable greatness, so that these gems of your grace might be mine. So it's a very beautiful image of the way that she's receiving these wounds. And I think it helps, she's working out, I think, how she's understanding her ministry, her spiritual ministry within Helfta and those who come seek her. She's seeing it as this symbolic marking, or for her, it's not symbolic, it's real. Okay, I put that word in her mouth, but she's experiencing it as real, as something that defines what she's doing in her ministry. And this language that I'm alluding to, this sacerdotal imagery, becomes more robust in another section in the Helfta tome, in the Revelations of Saint Gertrude. So in book 4, it's written by the nuns of Helfta. I won't show you that quite yet. It's written by the nuns of Helfta. This is book 4. It's not in Gertrude's hand, but it's an account by the nuns of Helfta about a vision that Gertrude had, where she says that Jesus appeared to her and breathed upon her, quoting from John 20, chapter 20, verses 20 to 23, receive the Holy Spirit, whatsoever sins you remit shall be remitted. right? It's a very sacerdotal thing to tell a nun, isn't it? So she's a bit worried that Jesus is telling her, Christ is telling her to remit sins. And she says to him, whoa, wait a minute, that's the priestly role. Why are you telling me this? And she's presented as being very anxious about this, this vision that she has with Christ breathing the Holy Spirit onto her. And this is what Jesus then tells her. When a deacon is made a priest, he does not cease to be a deacon, but rather he acquires a higher sacerdotal dignity. And so when I give you the same gift to your soul several times, I establish it more firmly therein, and thereby increase your beatitude. So this is articulating even more strongly this sense of, a quasi-priestly role that the language at least is introducing into how the nuns perceive Gertrude, and indeed how Gertrude perceives her own role. And just quickly to mention Mechtilde of Hackeborn, who was also a nun within the Helfta community. And she was also known for her council prayers and preaching. And very similarly, there's an account where Jesus comes to her and impresses his self onto her soul that's like a wax, this great image, and impresses himself onto her soul and leaves his imprint on her. And lo and behold, she also has a substantial role within the Helfta community, although they're not abbesses or anything. But these are these spiritual ministries that they have. So in these ways, I think that it gives us a bit of a sense of the role and authority that they played is understood as replicating to a certain degree a form of spiritual ordination, as it were. And this is something that I would argue. So here's another little bit of science, theological science bit that I'd like to interpose in between talking about Gertrude and then going on to Catherine of Siena, is the idea of ordination. So women's invisible stigmata are contrast with 12th and 13th century change of who can be ordained into a particular role. And so before the 12th century, both men and women were described as ordained to serve a particular ministry in a religious community. And what I mean here is that by ordained is that that term, that verb was used to describe abbots and abbesses who were ordained into a particular role, or deacons or deaconesses ordained into a particular role. By the 13th century, though, that whole notion of ordained being applied to abbesses or deaconesses is stripped away. And by the Fourth Lateran Council, which was a big reforming council, the term ordination had become precise, restricted, and gendered. A man was ordained to the sacerdotal order in order to bestow him with the authority to consecrate the bread and wine of the Eucharist. So that terminology becomes much more restrictive in the 13th century. And if you're interested in reading up on this and in greater detail that I could ever give, Gary Macy is the go-to expert. He's written this amazing book, The Hidden History of Women's Ordination, Female Clergy in the Medieval West, which is a very helpful one. And I was referring in particular to pages 29 to 33 in this little summary of what I have here, how the term ordination becomes more restrictive in the 13th century. So I would say too, something to note, concurrently with the changed focus of ordination belonging only to men, or that notion of belonging through the ritual of ordination to a certain role belonging only to men, the phenomena of invisible wounding emerged in relation to female piety. So there this seems to be coming up just when ordination is becoming restrictive. We start to see this development of invisible stigmata associated with people like Gertrude of Helfta, etc. And in no case, I think, can we probably say that this is more strongly witnessed than with the case of Catherine of Siena, who's probably, after Francis of Assisi, is the best known stigmatic, even if you're not working in this area at all. Catherine of Siena was within the scholarship is very much recognized, and within popular devotion as well, as, you know, one of the great stigmatics of the Middle Ages. And Catherine of Siena was a laywoman, and by no means, you know, from a, she was from a respectable family, but by no means a noble family. And she attracted a lot of attention early on through her great works of charity and through her extreme practice of asceticism. And she also attracted great support among a number of high-ranking ecclesiastical figures who saw in her a certain renewal within the church through her various practices. And so she had a lot of support at different levels, and also was a renowned letter writer. She wrote nearly 400 letters to every sort of person you could think of, trying to give direction, spiritual direction, on how to reform themselves, how to reform the church. And indeed, I think she's probably best described as a reformer. And she had 3 key aspects to her reform, which I'll just quickly go over here. First was her concern to return the papacy from Avignon to Rome. During her lifetime, the papacy had resettled in Avignon due to various political reasons. And she advocated for a crusade against the Turks, and to establish peace between Christians and factious Tuscany, which was very war-torn at her time during her life. So she's very much involved, you know, in big issues. And she's also commissioned or brought on board by the papacy. So Pope Gregory XI, Urban VI are very engaged with Catherine of Siena as being somebody who represents their religious ideals. She's mainly remembered, however, by being a mystic, portrayed as a mystic. But we have to remember that there's this real active side to Catherine of Siena's life. Yes, a mystic, but there's also this activity that is important to keep in mind. So we have this very interesting figure who's partaking in peace negotiations, who's helping with reforming the church, and is right in the thick of it. And she is portrayed, as I say, as a stigmatic. But unlike Gertrude, who, I should add, Gertrude is the first person, full stop, right? First stigmatic to actually write about their own experience as being bearing the wounds of Christ. So she's the first person that we have evidence. She writes about it in her own words. Francis of Assisi never wrote about it in his lifetime. It comes out after his death. Catherine of Siena never wrote about having stigmata. So we learn about this through one of her great supporters, Raymond of Capua, who was a Dominican who enabled Catherine to really get involved with papal affairs, because he was very well connected. So this is what he writes about Catherine of Siena's stigmatization, and it's an account of. He says this is what he told her, that she said while in front, and Raymond was there, and he said that after the event, she said, quote, I saw the Lord fixed to the cross above me, descending in a great light. Because of the impulse of my mind and my will to meet its creator, my body was compelled to rise up. Then from the scars of his most sacred wounds, I saw 5 bloody rays descending towards my hands, my feet, and my heart. Wherefore, perceiving the mystery, I quickly exclaimed, "O my Lord God, I beg you, do not let the scars show externally on my body." As I was saying this, before the rays had reached me, their color changed from blood red into brilliant light. And in the form of pure light, the rays reached the 5 places of my body, namely my hands, feet, and heart. Okay. So yes, that's quite an extensive description that Raymond supplies for us about what he's saying happened in the church. This happened supposedly in Pisa while he was with Catherine, and you could see that it's also witnessed by people, which indicates that this is even more important. People were there and could lend some validity to that something was going on when they were watching Catherine receive her invisible stigmata. Now, I just want to break down a little bit the quotes, that quote, the stigmatization quote from Raymond's Life of Catherine of Siena, the Legenda Maior, the Great Life of Catherine of Siena, and just indicate that there's very many sacramental aspects to the actual stigmatization on many different levels. So first of all, Catherine's invisible wounds are triggered by her reception of the Eucharist from the hands of her confessor. So she receives communion, and then this triggers the stigmatization. But it's received by the sacerdotal hands of Raymond of Capua. Then in a vision, the crucified Christ impressed her with golden wounds after she beseeched him to change them from their original bloody red into gold, because she didn't want people to see them. So I say, like the priest's words during the Mass, which affect transubstantiation, Catherine's words, "O my Lord God, I beg you, do not let these scars show externally on my body," caused a change in the color and quality of the wounds she received from Christ. So she's helping effect at the altar the change of the nature of the wounds from visible into invisible. Okay, so I think that's a remarkable thing to keep in mind. This is all happening at the altar. So I say there's a similarity with the concept of transubstantiation, whereby the Eucharistic accidents of the bread and wine conceal the actual flesh and blood of Christ. When the priest says over the Mass, you know, the bread and the wine are changed into the body and blood of Christ, that happens with transubstantiation, but it's concealed. The actual reality is concealed, and it still looks like bread and wine. And Catherine's wounds were hidden, but no less real as the palpable and bloody ones that Francis bore. So there's a very strong sacramental quality to the way that Catherine actually receives the wounds themselves. It's very ritualistic, and I think that's important to keep in mind. It's done all, I think what's very powerful too, that it's all framed work within front of the altar, where the Eucharistic mystery occurs as well. It's important to note that Raymond was a huge supporter of Catherine. That's an understatement. And in his Legenda Maior, he talks about Catherine as a preacher. Catherine preached. Catherine has, of course, he focuses on her mystical aspects, but we do learn from Raymond also her what he calls her preaching. So there is a ministerial quality that we see within Catherine, the way Raymond portrays her. He never said that during her life. That may have been too dangerous. It's after her death, he identifies her actions, her words, her eloquence as preaching. But nonetheless, I think the stigmatization is an important framework to keep that in mind. Just like with Gertrude, there's a sense of ministry that follows with the marking, just like a priest with ordination. The roles that these women play are significant, and their marks, I'm using the word symbolically, but to them very real moments of these ritualistic portrayals. To further this point, I just want to give an example about Catherine's active role associated with her stigmata. We're going to move to the 15th century because it is such a powerful example that I feel that I need to present it. And it's given by Gabriel Barletta, who was a Dominican preacher. And he preached, he wrote numerous sermons, and one of them was, or a few of them were sermons on Catherine of Siena. And in one of them, he discusses, a section in them, he discusses her stigmatization, and he also talks about her active life. But he makes an implicit, or perhaps I should even say explicit, connection between Catherine's hidden wounds, her stigmata, and her preaching. And he says that after she received the gift of invisible stigmata, Catherine was called to give a sermon before Pope Urban VI and the cardinals of Rome. So he's making it as a very powerful statement that she preached and that she received these wounds. And then right after he says this in his sermon, he says, "I know what you're thinking, gentlemen, I know what you're thinking. Paul the apostle said that women should not preach but keep quiet in church, and that Timothy said women should not teach. Yes, I know all that," he says. "But certain women like Mary Magdalene, the Virgin Martyrs, and Catherine of Siena received dispensation to preach because of their very great virtues." So, yeah, he puts it right out there. This is his argument. And I think it's important too that he prefaces her preaching with this, before this statement comes the stigmatization. So I say her invisible stigmata were understood as a part of the foundation for her dispensation to preach, functioning as a mark and justification of her ministry, as well as a hallmark of her sanctity. So it's kind of doing double duty. Not only is she represented, she indicates her sanctity, but it's also getting back to that notion of invisible stigmata being an indication of a special ministry that these women have. Now, just when you thought, wow, I didn't know they were so liberal in the Middle Ages, there were detractors, and there were people who were not very happy with this situation. So I need to name a few of them. Bartolomeo of Pisa wrote a huge tome on comparing the life of Francis to the life of Jesus. And within it, there's a number of sections in there that do deal with the stigmatization of Francis. And the whole debate was very alive at the time of female stigmatization, and could women receive stigmata? How could women receive it? Some people objected to this, and Bartolomeo, a Franciscan, was one of them. Franciscans were not too happy when non-Franciscans especially claimed to have experienced this grand miracle that their great saint Francis of Assisi did. So he writes about female stigmatization, and a lot of the terms and the way he's presenting it, just let me say this, it rehearses a lot of arguments that were used, that were employed in canon law, of why women shouldn't preach and why they cannot be ordained. Okay, so very similar language used here in regards to why women cannot be stigmatized. So he says, It was becoming for the Lord Jesus Christ to imprint his stigmata of the passion on a certain person. And the presupposition was that they be imprinted on the manly human sex alone, since if it had been fitting to be done to a woman, it would have been done to the Blessed Mary, the Mother of Christ, by means of her sanctity and by her prerogative of virtues. Moreover, nowhere is it read in the Old or New Testament that a particular woman was directed to renew the world, and consequently, no woman has been consigned with stigmata. So there was a huge debate about this in the Middle Ages. And some people, were very, made even stronger connections between the debates or the arguments that were used for stigmatization and priestly ordination or women's preaching, and why both are not accepted. Pulbartus of Temsvar, who was a very influential Franciscan preacher, repeated Bartolomeo's arguments in his sermon on Francis of Assisi, as did many Franciscan preachers, but he also added very robustly that the Apostle Paul said that women are to keep quiet in church and not teach. So he saw a correlation between female stigmatization and the assumption that this may indicate that women have some kind of right to preach or to teach publicly. So, it indicates a huge debate. It's quite interesting because very often you don't really see direct debates about female ordination, but when you look at stigmatization, you get the rumblings of those debates embedded in these sermons that were very widespread. But ultimately, at least in regards to the authenticity of stigmatization for women, Catherine and female stigmatics won out in the end, because the papacy ultimately recognized the possibility that women could be stigmatized just as men, and that it wasn't that it was gender blind. It wasn't a gendered miracle. It could happen to anyone. So very, these statements are said, but as I say, the stigmatization of women wins out within high up when the papacy recognizes Catherine and others as stigmatic saints. So let me just conclude here. My main points is that, whoops, my conclusion is blocked. This happened, yeah. Sorry, this happened yesterday too. I can't quite see my own PowerPoint for various technical reasons, and I'm going to go through it all again. So I will get there to my conclusion, and it will just take a moment. Here we go. So you can look at all these images again. Lots of delayed presentation. Okay, so more slides than I thought. Here we are. Okay, so my conclusion. The invisible wounds that appeared on Gertrude and Catherine are embedded in a tradition of sacramental language, recalling priestly stigmata. Gertrude of Helfta's first-hand account demonstrates that she understood her special wounds, as uniting her nothingness to the gold of God's greatness. Gabriel Barletta associated Catherine's pastoral activities with her status as stigmatic, defending her dispensation to preach. Women who were described as bearing invisible wounds belonged to a late medieval ordo of stigmatics, whose souls were marked with and transformed into the image of Christ. Their extraordinary relationships with the divine distinguished them in the eyes of their supporters as fitting recipients of the character of leadership. The extraordinary roles these women played in medieval religious life draw attention to the subtle but significant meaning that invisible stigmata held as a validating symbol of female engagement. So I'll end it there. Thank you for your attention. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. There's so much in there, so rich. We'll give everybody a moment to sort of process and think of questions.
Can I just say something, Marika, as people process, because just for the people that were at last night's talk, I spoke about Angela of Foligno, and I spoke about, now I'm going like Clara of Montefalco and Margherita of Faenza. And they all at some point were also deemed to have stigmata in some of the writings. So, and they had very marked ministries. So just as a follow-up, so to further examples of this.
Awesome. Well, I see a first question from Joy.
Carolyn, thank you so much. Wow, it's really wonderful to learn about these two stigmatics, and the idea of the invisible stigmata is so compelling. And I'm really struck by Catherine's request that the wounds not be visible, especially in a context in which female authority is maybe facing new challenges as ordination is removed from women. I fully agree with the insight that makes her stigmata more sacramental, because it's sort of like a sort of transubstantiation. But what do you make of this request? Do you think she was thinking of transubstantiation there? Of course, we don't know what she was thinking, but what do you make of that request that it not be visible? I find that so interesting.
Yeah, and I know. Well, first of all, we don't really know what she said, because it comes through the vita, right? The hagiography, and she never writes. I mean, that's why Gertrude's account is so valuable, because she actually talks about it. So Catherine only once alludes to how her soul has been wounded. You know, so she in a letter, her soul has been wounded, which is reminiscent of invisible stigmata. I think, you know, visible stigmata probably bring their own problems. Women who and men who were claimed to have visible stigmata were investigated. You know, they were bodily investigation, very intrusive. So that there's one practicality there too. So invisible stigmata, you know, you can't really physically investigate that, can you? So, but I do think that, you know, Catherine within her own lifetime had carved out quite a remarkable niche for herself through her active agency of letter writing and, you know, outspokenness. And that the discussion of stigmata would have been an aside for her, I think. She was very focused on that. So I think we have to turn to Raymond of Capua and try to figure out why you know, his presentation of Catherine, I see it, the way I interpret it is that he sees it as a validation of her active ministry, and the way he understands it is very sacramental and ritualistic, and that validates her actions, I think, for him, and I think for the wider community that is reading the Vita, because this is an attempt to have her canonized, and so there has to be some explanation of why she is such an unusual example of sanctity, a very active, uncloistered woman who is said to be preaching. And so I think the answers may lie more with Raymond than with Catherine. That's my take on it. But yeah, and there's been a lot of speculation about why she says that, and why, you know, does she say it out of humility, or but she doesn't, it's really not expanded upon in the actual legenda why she makes that request.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We've got Isaac next, and then Marika.
Thank you, Carolyn, for a very educational talk.
Hi, Isaac.
Hi, thank you very much. Very enjoyable talk. Coming to Bartholomew of Pisa, one easy way to refute him would be to claim that actually the Theotokos also had invisible stigmata, and to link that to the prophecy of the sword that would pierce her heart. Has anyone argued this way?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the first part? I didn't hear. What historical character did you refer to?
Bartholomew of Pisa.
Oh, yes.
He said, if women could have stigmata, why didn't Mary have stigmata? And you could counter-argue and say, actually, she did. She had invisible stigmata. And this is what Simeon was talking about when he said a sword would pierce your heart. Has anyone argued this way?
Absolutely, yes. In the images that I was showing you, where you see Catherine of Siena, Gertrude of Helfta, and Francis of Assisi having, depictions of how you depict them in art with invisible stigmata, visible stigmata. The person who put that treatise together, Tommaso Caffarini, lo and behold, among his list of stigmatics in there is the Virgin Mary. He cites the Luke passage with the sword being pierced into her heart, and presents Mary as the co-redemptrix, co-stigmatic, and really the first female stigmatic in the history of the church. So he mounted that argument, and it had been mounted as early as the 13th century, that Mary's virginity and her virginal flesh was the perfect land to imprint the wounds of Christ. So there were strong arguments and links made to the Virgin Mary. So yes, that was part of the big debate I was arguing about, that they argued about in the Middle Ages, and some people claiming that Mary did indeed have the wounds and was a stigmatic. So thank you for that question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we'll have Marika, then Laura, and then there's a question in the chat from Tinu. So Marika, do you want to go next?
I'm calling to mind the emphasis that's put on the idea of the wounded healer, particularly in our time, and I think particularly referring to Henri Nouwen. But that image has become quite widespread, I think, even outside of the religious community. And I'm wondering if you're aware of any direct connection between that image and all of these sorts of things that you've been talking about here.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Stigmatic saints were very often associated with healing, full stop. So Francis of Assisi, for example, the posthumous miracles indicate that, or accounts of the miracles during his life, and in his Vita is written that water that he bathed in was given to some animals who had all been sick, and they were all cured. Or Catherine of Siena was a very important plague saint. People would pray to her image to be cured or to prevent plague. Saint Sebastian kind of factors into this, the saint who's depicted in art with all the wounds. And he and stigmatic saints very often are presented as healing saints. People touch their wounds, pray to their wounds in their images. So the correlation between the wounded stigmatic incorporates the whole idea of the healing body of Christ as well. So it goes full circle. They're representative, they're reminders of the suffering Christ, but also the healing Christ, the body of Christ. So those are all interconnected, and they're very, very closely associated with illness. Thank you.
Laura.
Oh,
you're muted again.
all right. I'm not very Zoom proficient. Thank you so much. There's so much fascinating here. I only knew Francis. I had no idea about that early Peter Damien ordination piece, which totally makes sense, connecting to both Gertrude and Catherine. And I'm actually a Gertrude scholar, so it's a thrill to see her spoken. Yeah, and I focused greatly on her work on how book 2 very much refers to Augustine's Confessions, same rhetoric, same images, and especially the piercing of the heart, which happens in the next. I believe the wounds in the heart are in chapter 4, and then the piercing of the heart, because that's inspired by a quote in Augustine that refers to conversion and knowing the love of God. And it's purely metaphorical in him, and then much more physical in Trace of Avila. And so Gertrude's kind of in the middle, much more, I would say, in the metaphorical. And so I've never heard her called, I've never thought of her as a stigmatic, because the wounds are in the heart, they're not on the hands and the feet, and they're no physical. She doesn't feel the pain and bleeding and so on. So I guess my question is, are there other, and I know there's I forget, it was Clara Montefiore that had the little nails in her heart, the physical things, but they're kind of metaphorical, like Gertrude wounds in the heart. Other figures that you see, and how you see that as the same and different, because again, I really associate Stigmata with the hands and feet and that art. I've never ever seen art like that of her, and I'd love it if you could give us a reference of that that piece, because I missed the first 5 minutes, and the art normally shows her maybe Jesus, or how you see is similar and different to Catherine, with more physical and in the hands and feet.
Yeah, I mean, the whole issue about what are stigmata, what is stigmatization, it becomes a huge issue, and becomes a large debate about what it can mean. And so Gertrude early on, you know, she's appropriated and taken up later on by the figure that I'm referring to is Tommaso Caffarini. That's the work you missed. I can send that to you. I can just upload it now for a minute if you want to see. Let's see.
Yeah, sure. When you showed it in the talk, which was great, but didn't catch the.
Oh, okay, yeah, I'll send it to you because it's a bit too awkward to get back to. But yeah, she's used by him as an example in order to make a stronger case that Catherine is indeed a stigmatic. That here we have a long history of women bearing the wounds of Christ. So not only the Virgin Mary, but he doesn't identify her as Gertrude. He's not aware of her name, but he quotes from the Herald of Divine Love, and uses that section where she talks about the stigmatization on her heart. But he uses her as an example of invisible stigmata. So there are.
There was a holy woman, saint and nun. He just says there was this holy woman.
There was a holy nun, German nun,
Wonderful, thank you. That's, again, I've never known a Helfta scholar that knew that piece, probably because she's not there. Yeah, so that's very helpful.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how these works circulate and how they're used. Yeah.
So we have a question in the chat from Tino, who asks, an article I read some time ago suggested that of the 400 or so attested stigmatics, most were women. This is also consistent with the fairly rare medical condition hematomathidrosis being more prevalent in women. Is there any literature of Catherine or others having particular illnesses?
Yeah, thanks for that, Tino. Yes, there's a lot of discussion about stigmata being associated with physical illness. We have an expert in the audience right here, Gabor Klanice, who's written extensively on this. And so there are studies that do, and medical studies, medical studies that look back historically to say that these accounts of stigmatization very often can be these different physical conditions. And so there are numerous studies on that. My particular take and interest is the way medieval and early modern people and the sources that we look at define and interpret those wounds. I mean, some of them do interpret them medically, but by and large, it's very much seen through the lens of a religious lens, or a symbolic lens, or a lens of devotion, or the sacramental lens that I'm referring to. But yes, there is a correlation there. And I think it really ties in too with Marika Hall-Bayer's question too, is that the stigmatic is viewed as, sympathetic to the sick, because there's some illness associated with them, but it's the healing sickness, it's the wounds of Christ. So it's very much integrated as well into the theology. But more often than not, the discussions dealing with the medical conditions deal with accounts of the physical stigmata as opposed to the invisible stigmata, accounts of, because often there's description associated with that. So medical historians sometimes try to assess that written description.
And we just have another question in the chat from Alina, who asks, what came first, the record of preaching validated by receiving the bodily dispensation in the form of bodily marks, or the stigmata that endowed the recipient with a gift of preaching?
So what came first, the record of preaching validated by receiving the divine? It's hard to say. I would say in Catherine's case, just piecing it together, that Raymond goes to great lengths not to call her spoken words, sermons, or preaching until after, when he writes to the Legenda Maior, he indicates that. I don't know. I think it's too difficult to separate both of them, because it's a sense of identity of what they do and who they are and how they describe what they're doing. In the case of Gertrude, she seems to really engage with her spiritual ministry after the discussion with Jesus and the feeling of being stigmatized in her heart, having the wounds of Christ impressed on her heart. But it's a really good question. I think they're just so intertwined. It's hard to separate the two. And it might even have been perceived as dangerous to separate the two for if women were just doing this off their own bat with no validation, symbolic validation.
I think Lisa's got a question.
Great. Thanks, Carolyn, for a wonderful talk. Sorry, this has been a long time since I've been able to go through this stuff, but thank you. I was curious about the representations and in the manuscript tradition, especially where you have the blushing or the blood, right? That comes on Catherine's face on the one hand, but also extends on the worshipers or her congregation surrounding. And so is that meant to, and you were bringing in Raymond too, in terms of the sacrificial nature or the ritual nature of the blood turning to light afterwards. But has there been any work that's been done in terms of that significance moving on to the, so not only the focus of red or blushing on Catherine per se, but also the worshipers, and how does, by extension, and does that consolidate the nature of her work per se that comes in?
Yeah, that's a good question. In regards to the account, if I'm remembering correctly, in the Legenda Maior, not only does she, receive the wounds, but I think there's discussion that her face is like beet red, or so that's coming through. She's really feeling the heat of the moment, the presence. I never really thought about the surrounding audience and how the surrounding audience, in a way, the subtext there is that very often Francis is presented in art either alone or with a brother Leo who has his nose buried in a book and is not paying attention to Francis. And the subtlety there is this Dominican who is creating this documentation about how to depict stigmatics is giving more credence to Catherine's case, because he's showing her experiencing this, and there's a number of witnesses there that can see that something's happening. And so the witnesses, not in every case, but in the ones that this particular character Caparini is putting forth, the witnesses are very important as a validation that something miraculous did indeed happen. So it's a participation, even though they're invisible, it's still a participation in this kind of ritualistic stigmatization.
Okay, thank you.
We just have a question in the chat here from Anna, who asks, I wonder if you would have any comment to make about Franciscan influence on later female stigmatics. To what extent might the description and reception of Francis' stigmata influence how people described and understood Catherine's stigmata? Are there Franciscan Dominican rivalries at play?
Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of rivalries. What's really interesting, and I'm sorry I didn't show it, I was going to show the earliest depiction that we have, or that we think we have, of Catherine of Siena receiving the stigmata. And it was done under Caffarini's watchful eye. It was one of the earliest depictions. And her reception of the stigmata looks exactly like Francis's reception in regards to receiving visible wounds from blood rays. So what you have there is an appropriation in the first iteration of presenting Catherine, them lobbying out that, claim Catherine is a stigmata, and they present her very similar to Francis because that's the precedent. But that imagery that associated with Caffarini and his school of thought does become more finessed in his treatise and the way he discusses it. And he claims that most stigmatizations, or key stigmatizations, are very unique and unto themselves. So in that case, there's an attempt to try to dismantle the dominance of Francis as an example of what stigmatization looks like. But that powerful image and the widespread cult of Francis of Assisi does shape a large amount of accounts of stigmatics later on, of people who say they receive their stigmata in prayer, like Francis. I mean, the similarities are very similar. I can't think of hard concrete examples at the moment, but he is a strong role model, of course. Yeah.
And yes, a question from Gabor.
Hello, Gabor.
Thank you very much, Carolyn, for this wonderful talk, and also this very nice logical connection between priestly ordaining and female invisible stigmata. Now, I've been thinking about the relationship of illness and invisible stigmata, because, as you mentioned, I wrote something on illness and stigmata, and of course, stigmata has been interpreted in such cases. There is, for example, Cistercian nun Lucardis of Oberweimar, who was very ill, was lying sick in her monastery, and was living her illness as Christ-like suffering. So I think there with the relationship is that those ill stigmatics were experiencing their bodily suffering as something similar to stigmatization, as a kind of redemptive suffering. Now, getting back to the invisible stigmata did not mean that the stigmata were not bodily in that sense, because at least the way Raymond of Capua described it, it was Catherine almost died of suffering after having been stigmatized. So, so that is very bodily suffering, which was even recognized by Franciscan critics, that okay, we understand that she experienced the suffering. Now, my question is, doesn't this cause a little bit of weakening of the argument that it's just like priest ordaining? Because the invisible stigmata were also related to stigmata as living the suffering of Christ, bearing the cross with Christ or hanging on the cross. And this is how most mystics described it, which was in a way, it intended to be as real as the real bodily wounds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think, in the case of Catherine, absolutely after this account that Raymond gives, he says that she didn't think she could bear to live, but then the pain does disappear of the wounds, he says. Gertrude doesn't seem to have pain, but she feels them. It's like this is quite a diversity. You think of Ossana of Mantua, who has she dies in the early 16th century. She's a woman who has invisible stigmata. She has great pain, and that disappears at times. So, but then you have people like Margherita of Faenza that I was talking about last. I didn't talk about her stigmata, but she suffers that pain, like incredibly. A feeling of pain and bodily pain, although people cannot see it. So I don't think it's mutually exclusive. I think that Juana de la Cruz, the great, I'm just thinking now, the great preacher from 16th century Spain, who has stigmata that lasts for a day, right? And then they disappear, and then they come back invisibly. And then she preaches at the pulpit. Okay, so I'm not trying to make hard and fast rules that it means only that it is like the priest's invisible stigmata. But I think if you look at invisible stigmata in relation to women, it's very often, but not in all cases, it's very often related not only to their bodily pain, but to their actions, to what they do, and how people understand what they do, or maybe accept what they do. So I guess I would say that. Yeah. So Catherine does have very strong physical, reaction. She thinks she's going to die. She does die, within a few years, but that pain does desist, at least in relation to the wounds, according to Raymond. But thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to highlight that there is a bodily aspect to these invisible wounds that are not only on the soul, but Catherine claim that she can see things, that she can see the wounds. Or maybe it corresponds with her mystical marriage that she has with Jesus, that she can see the ring on her finger, she can see the wounds on her body. Other people can't see them, but she can. So there is a strong bodily aspect to it. So thank you for highlighting that.
Good. Are there any other questions? I think Stephanie's going to read out a few comments that are in the chat while people think for a minute.
Mm-hmm. Earlier on, George did add that there are statues post-Reformation of Mary with 7 swords through her heart, but that he doesn't necessarily know of art that represents Mary with more traditional stigmata. And then Anna also added to this conversation that the identity of Francis as preacher is also an interesting link to this argument about stigmata as marks of ministry.
Could I just, Anna, thank you for that, because I think that's a really important point, because Francis, technically, he wasn't a priest, he wasn't a priest. And he's renowned as one of the greatest preachers of the medieval church. And I think there is, I don't know, maybe Gabor knows, I don't know if this argument has been made too, Francis's stigmata have been represented as a validation of the Franciscan order by God as the best order. But, you know, maybe on a smaller scale, it's a validation of Francis, who is technically, you know, he's a lay person, really. He's not a priest, right? He's not ordained as a priest, but he's a preacher. And he's doing the activities of what a priest is doing. And in a way, the stigmata can be functioning on some level as a validation of his ministry. So Anna, thank you for that question. Yeah, it's something to reflect on.
Any final questions? I'll use my prerogative and ask you a quick one. I'm fascinated by the idea of invisible stigmata and the way it reclaims agency for these women. Is this, am I out to lunch with this, or is it?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it's very often things that are, unless you're someone like me or Gabor and other people who are working on stigmata, I mean, it's almost like a throwaway in a text when you talk about invisible stigmata. But then when you see the amount of times that it starts to occur, and you see the types of women it's associated with, yeah, I would be very, I'm fairly confident to say that it is an indication that you should look, if you're interested in women's role and in the church, that if you're reading about somebody having invisible stigmata, it might be good to look at what has been said about them and written about them. And I'm almost sure that it will indicate some kind of exceptional interaction or role that they play.
I'm just absolutely fascinated. I'll probably be bugging you for the next few weeks.
That's okay.
I've just had a request from Ottfried to ask you a question.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm interested in the anatomy of stigmata. I noticed, I've never studied the subject, but I noticed that the early persons, Franciscus, Gertrude, they have stigmata where they belong. Because the heart, Jesus was not wounded in his heart, it was his right side, where the lance opened his body. And this is the place which is usually shown when Thomas wants to touch this wound. But I noticed that Raymond in his account, in his written account, he puts the heart at the focus. He receives one of the stigmata on her heart. And I think maybe this is also can be seen in the iconography of stigmata. Is there a shift from the Jesus-like right side, which is much below the heart, where it usually is opened, to the heart, maybe as a specific detail of female stigmata, to approach her to Maria? Probably too speculative, but
no, not at all. I mean, it's again, those issues would be debated too, about where the nails went in the feet and hands. And Catherine, in the Vita, there's a mini stigmatization before the big one, and it has to deal with the exchange of hearts with Christ, where it's this great image where Christ. Eventually, both he and Catherine exchange hearts. And it was claimed that with that exchange, a scar was left in her chest, where the heart had been taken out and replaced by, her heart was taken out by Christ, and Christ put his heart into her. And there was a mark that was a visible stigma, I guess you'd say, on her chest. Now I have to say, I haven't really paid a lot of attention to placements of the wounds. And I don't know if I could just ask Gabor, I don't know, Gabor, have you worked on placements and where the wounds occur on the chest? And is there a change over time, or is it a jumble?
There are varieties, and I think with Catherine, the wound is on the left side. And that's precisely because she didn't want to want to be the same as Francis, probably. and it went right into the heart. So that's how I remember. I think Caffarini discusses that, but that's how I recall. But so there is a variety of the side wound. That's for sure.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And Imabong.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're
Very good.
welcome.
Now, stigmata is beginning to form in my mind more and more as a validation of ministry, or if you will, the divine's movement in human activity to present maybe something new that is going on, to address something that should be looked at. And so with the restriction of ordination on women, of getting it down to gender, you know, I'm understanding that stigmata, maybe I'm right, or maybe also I'm out to lunch as well, but I'm beginning to sense it more as the divine's way of saying, pay attention to what's happening here with women in ministry. And I'm beginning to wonder, would this be akin to Cornelius in chapter 10 of the book of Acts, who, you know, he's of the Gentiles, you know, and the Spirit is beginning to move from ministry of the Jews into the Gentile ministry. And so Peter, who is called to Cornelius' house, will not readily accept to go until he's given that vision. And then the Holy Spirit comes upon Cornelius and his whole household. And then it's something different, something new for the bystanders to note. Something important is happening here. So let's pay attention to the movement of the divine here. Do you think stigmata is something akin to that experience?
I would have to, yes, I agree with your summation there. I think that at least in the examples I've been looking, these are very compelling cases of women's interaction, sometimes within their community, but also further afield. And they seem to be exceptional, notable. You know, that term character, you know, the term character that is used by the early pastoral theologians, the marking, the character that comes with the roles or the exceptional responsibilities that these people have. And so the cases, these two particular women, I think the two match up. I'd be interested to see if, you know, there are cases of invisible stigmatics who really don't have a very interesting life. I want someone to show me that, you know, show me an uninteresting invisible stigmatic, and I would be intrigued to hear about her or him.
Thank you. Thank you. And again, very illuminating. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Any further questions? Give it one more minute. The odd Zoom silences we're all getting used to. Well, if you will all join me in thanking Dr. Muessig for a wonderful talk. And, thank you all very much for spending your Friday afternoon with us.
Thank you for the great questions.
And just a reminder that tomorrow at the Calgary Public Library, Carolyn will be doing another talk at 1 o'clock. And if you have any trouble getting registered for the talk, just email the library and they will. Because there's a complicated thing with library cards, but you don't actually need a library card if you email. So thank you all. And thank you, Carolyn, for a wonderful talk. And everybody have a wonderful Friday night.
Bye-bye, everyone. Great to see you all.